welcome back to Book Lust. I'm Nancy Pearl. My guest today at University Bookstore is writer Neal Stephenson. Neal, thank you so much for coming by.
It's a pleasure. I wouldn't miss it.
I have so much to talk to you about because I've been a fan for such a long time. So I was very happy that your new book, Fall, or Dodge in Hell, is coming out, and this was a good excuse to try to have you come down to the store and talk to me.
Yeah, I'm glad it worked out.
So tell me a little bit, a book that's about I think it's like 800 pages. It's hard, give or take, 100 pages. It's hard to give an elevator pitch to, but when somebody says, well, what is this book about? I mean, I was trying to in my head, to figure out how I would describe the book to somebody.
Well, it's sort of a mashup of Paradise Lost and video games, and I guess a key thing to understand about it is that it turns into a sort of twofold narrative, with one of the narratives being kind of in the vein of a techno thriller set in our world, and the other one being it develops into a kind of high fantasy storyline after a while, set in a fictitious world that basically exists as a computer simulation in the cloud.
Oh, that's good.
You like that?
I like that. That is good. And it does absolutely describe the book. What I liked about it so much was I really liked the characters, and one of the characters that I got quite fond of right from the beginning was Corvallis Kawasaki. And partly I was drawn to him because of that great name.
Oh yeah. Well, he was a character. There's sort of two kinds of characters that emerge when you're writing, and one is the person the people that you know ahead of time that the book is going to be about this person who's like thus and such, and then there's the character that just emerges accidentally as a secondary character, and frequently ends up being at least as interesting as the ones that you had sketched out ahead of time. And Corvallis is one of those. He just sort of popped into the narrative of Reamdi, which is kind of like the prequel to Fall, as a character who suddenly became kind of cool and interesting. And so when I decided to pick up the thread in Fall, I knew that he'd be a good character to base a lot of the story around.
But you don't have to read. I just want, so for viewers, just want to tell them that this is a real standalone. Yeah,
it really is. So I say it's that Reamdi was a prequel, and in some sense it is, in that Reamdi has a couple of the same characters, but this is a very different book from Reamdi, and it's if you're a Reamdi reader expecting kind of a straight up sequel in the same vein, you'll be surprised, hopefully pleasantly surprised by how different this one is.
All your books seem to be very different one from the other. I mean, you're characterized, which I think is, well, you're characterized as a science fiction writer, but it has always seemed to me that your books are, well, I'm not a fan of the ghettoization of any type of book, but it's always seemed to me that your books, whatever boundaries we put on science fiction, you're elbowing those boundaries.
Yeah, I think a lot of science fiction writers are, so I'm proud and happy to be numbered among the ranks of science fiction writers. I've never had any hesitation about that, but if you look at that field, I think you can find many examples of authors who are taking that style of writing into directions that might not be noticed or appreciated by people who kind of stand outside of it and see science fiction as a sort of monolithic kind of formulaic kind of writing.
Yeah, I mean, what I have against that shelving all the science fiction books together in a library or a bookstore is that people who think that they're not a fan are not going to find their way there and find, for example, I think there's a lot of social, in all your books, but in this book, which is so current, you're talking a lot about events that seem to be just a year or two ahead of us, you know, like where we're heading for.
Yeah, it starts out as a more near-term kind of science fiction book, and gets it covers a big span of time, and so it gets more speculative and far out as the story goes along.
Right, but there is this place in the book where you could see that we're just heading lickety-split to that place where, and I, you know, one of the parts that I find myself just shaking my head and like, oh my gosh, this is really, I mean, Neal Stephenson can tell the future when everybody has their personal, if you have enough money, you have your personal editor who's your filter, who curates you, right? Yeah, I mean, is that something that's on your mind?
Well, it's an idea that emerges from what's been going on recently in kind of the social media industry, and the fact that those companies their whole business model is based on not having any humans in the loop. So as long as all the choices are made by an algorithm, then they don't have to pay people to serve in an editorial capacity. And the result has not been good. So this is me kind of in a maybe sort of whimsical way saying, well, what if we did start paying humans to be in that loop?
And that's some of the characters in here are clearly, well, they're relatives of the billionaire of Dodge, Uncle Dodge. Yeah. And so they can afford that personal touch. But even the way I personally really enjoyed the way you segued from here we are in Seattle, which is where the book begins, and then takes us to Iowa to a whole new world, and then into this kind of Paradise Lost mock-up of what the world might be.
Well, again, I'm glad you enjoyed it. It's a series of sometimes big jumps, you know. But my experience to date in my career has been that people are willing to go along and give new things a try and sort of take those big jumps if you can make it a good story.
So did Milton make Paradise Lost a good story for you? I mean, that was clearly on your mind? Yeah,
the larger story of Milton himself is actually almost more interesting than what he wrote. But he went to Italy and met Galileo. He had some really interesting experiences in his younger life. But of course, what we know him for is Paradise Lost, which is a really interesting read in that it comes off almost like high fantasy science fiction if you just read it straight, you know, without any kind of preconceptions or without, you know, thinking about the religious, what he's trying to sell you religiously. It just reads as kind of straight Tolkien style high fantasy. And you know, it's pretty action-packed in some places. They have wars between different armies of angels, and they're shooting at each other with cannons, and you know, all kinds of stuff that definitely is not in the Bible.
What influenced you to begin writing, and particularly, were you a science fiction fan as a kid?
Yeah. I mostly read the science fiction of the day when I was a kid, and then later got introduced to what we call literature by a series of truly fantastic English teachers in Ames, Iowa, and then sort of curved back into science fiction and fantasy later in my 20s, when I sort of got interested in what you could do in those genres.
Were the early books that you read, was that like Heinlein's Citizen of the Galaxy and Red Planet?
Yeah, the Heinlein stuff, you know, the Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke. I would get these sort of anthologies of short stories, Dune, Poul Anderson, sort of the classic golden age of science fiction writers.
One of my favorite science fiction books is Gateway, the Frederick Pohl book.
I don't remember reading
Okay, so I think the year it came out, I happened to look this up because of the picture of the black hole finally that we saw.
Oh yeah.
And that reminded me of a plot point in Frederick Pohl's Gateway. So I happened to look it up, and it won every award the year it came out, which I think was, well, I don't know, in the 70s maybe.
Okay.
And I just wondered if that was one of the books, but you don't remember reading. Well, that's something for you to read.
I probably read it. I mean, I read a lot, and this was, you know, in the late 60s, early 70s. So I've got a big kind of mass of stuff that I remember from that back then, but for whatever reason, the Heinlein material sticks in my memory most clearly.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's because he was really good at moments, specific situations that really struck home and created a powerful image.
For me too, he's the one who stands out, and I could still probably tell you the plot of most of those books, or at least the outline and some of the characters in each of those books. I mean, that's a pretty amazing thing to be able, I mean, I think we probably read them at the same time, to still be able to look back. And,
yeah, I remember specific conversations, lines of dialogue.
Right.
So Heinlein's an interesting cat in that way.
And when you sat down to write your early books, what was why did you decide to do that?
Well, I had an interest in the idea of being a writer from very early, and had tried my hands when I was a teenager at writing some short stuff, because there was sort of and still is, I think, sort of a received wisdom that you begin by writing short pieces and work your way up to the big stuff, which seems very logical, but I actually think it's wrong, because, I mean, if it works for a given person, that's great, but I think a lot of novelists, certainly I am just more comfortable with writing a full book. It's just much easier for me to write a whole book than it is to write a short story.
Yeah, I recently interviewed a writer who said that every novel that I can't remember who it was, so he or she has written was a failed short story. So, or a failed attempt to,
anyway, so, but because of that, I had formed the opinion in my late teens that this wasn't going to work out, because if I couldn't really write short stories, then how could I possibly aspire to write novels? And then when I was in college, I was stuck in Boston over a long holiday break with nothing to do and no money. So I just sat down and kind of spontaneously wrote a novel. and so that it wasn't a great piece of writing, but it made me aware of the fact that I was capable of writing novels. And so then after college, I wrote a second one, which also, it didn't get published and didn't deserve to get published. But then I then went on to write a third one after that. Came to the attention of Gary Fisketjon, an editor who went through it page by page and basically gave me taught me how to do it. Look, if you remove this entire page, nothing happens. You can get rid of this. Or anyway, a lot of lessons like that emerged from the line by line editing of that book, which was then published as The Big U.
Your baroque trilogy has always seemed to me to be a history of like 17th century science. Where did that come from?
So that emerged spontaneously as I was finishing Kryptonomicon. Kryptonomicon is about gold, and it's about computers, and sort of the informational basis of money. But within the same week, I happened to get a communication from George Dyson up in Bellingham, who was talking about the early history of computing in the form of Leibniz, what Leibniz made, and from a friend of mine at Wesleyan about Isaac Newton working on in his tenure at the Mint, making money for the English government, and I just thought it was striking that here we have these two people, one who were contemporaries, the two smartest, most eminent savants in the world at the time, one of them working on computers, one of them working on money, and they hated each other. So I thought, okay, there's got to be something here. It's a place I could go after Kryptonomicon. And then I started researching that general period of history, and it's not, in American history courses, it's not well covered.
Is that how most of your books came to be written, because almost happenstance in a way, that somebody sends you something that's interesting and then you do a research into it and discover, yeah, this would be...
It's always kind of different. There's no clear pattern as to how these things come into existence. And so usually I'll see a news story or some interesting historical fact, and I'll start thinking about it. For example, Reamde came about because years before I started writing it, there was a story of a kid in the Philippines who created a computer virus that went all over the world and caused a lot of havoc, and that just got me thinking about how that could be the basis for a story. And then years later, it all kind of came together in a certain way. So a lot of times it begins with something like that, and then it'll incubate sometimes for years, and then when I reach one of those moments where it's time to decide what I'm going to write next, I'll say, okay, this one's ready. Yeah, I'm really interested in this. I want to.
And when you say it incubates, in your head, or do you have like a notebook, or or on your
mostly
computer?
in the head, yeah, yeah. These aren't so complicated that they need to be written down. It's mostly fairly simple groups of characters and storylines and an idea of where things are going. And so that was true of Fall. And, you know, it was just in my head for a while, and no need really to write anything down because it's not that voluminous. You know.
But when you start writing then, how do you keep, I mean, how do you keep track of, do you outline?
No, if the chronology is complicated, I'll use a spreadsheet or something to keep track of that in different columns so I don't mess up the chronology.
Right.
So in the case of Fall, for example, it extends over a pretty long span of time, and I had to, and I'm jumping back and forth, as I mentioned, between these two worlds, so I needed to keep them in sync, which is made harder by the fact that in this story, the imaginary world, bit world, its time, it always moves forward, but it moves at different rates. So I'll keep track of that, but I'm not a big believer in outlining ahead of time, just because I think it fixes a particular plan and gives it a legitimacy it probably doesn't deserve. You're going to come up with better ideas as you go along, and if you've got this outline that you wrote a year ago at the beginning of the project before you knew what you know now, then it's easy to get hung up on, it's easy for that to just become an obstacle.
I remember John Irving saying that he doesn't start a book until he has written the last line, which is a different way of thinking about it.
Yeah, I sort of did that with the Baroque cycle because it was so big. I needed to know where it was going to go. I kind of did that, not to the point of actually writing the last line, but I kind of knew what the
where
final
you were
bit
going.
was going to be.
Yeah. I remember when I read Kryptonomicon, which I want to spend a little time, we don't have a lot of time, but a little time just talking about, because it really is one of my 10 favorite, 20, among my very, very favorite books, and I reread it, and I've always felt with that book, like the Baroque trilogy, is that partly it's history. I mean, you're writing about World War II, and the characters in that, the Shaftos and the Waterhouses, but especially the Shaftos, I always felt were some of your best creations.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I'm a big fan of those people, very fond of them. Charles Brown, the late Charles Brown, told me something I didn't know, which was that I was writing something called secret history, which is it's a term meaning a historical book in which the characters and events are pretty much as they happened. So it's not alternate history, right? You're not changing the outcome, but you're sort of weaving through the real stuff a fictional thread. And so it's people doing things maybe behind the scenes or interacting with real historical characters in a way that kind of supplies a fictional backdrop. And so the role of the Shaftos and the Waterhouses in both Kryptonomicon and the Baroque cycle is to be that. So we've got, in Kryptonomicon, for example, we've got Douglas MacArthur. It's a larger-than-life character in real life, and he's got this kind of bizarre relationship with Bobby Shafto that plays out during the second half of the book. So those characters are kind of made to play that role in a way. I have to say, I've always appreciated your characters' names. I'm a big name person. I mean, I love thinking of characters' names, and so Bobby Shafto, whenever I always think of that nursery rhyme. Yeah, so that came from the nursery rhyme. And when I encountered that nursery rhyme, it just, okay, yeah, that's a great, I'm not going to do better than that, than that name.
Yeah. But it's also a Kryptonomicon. I say Nomicon, you say Nomicon, so I'm going to start saying Kryptonomicon.
I used to worry about it until I was doing an appearance in England, and a gentleman came up to me and said, you know, I really enjoyed your earlier book, Kryptonomicon. And then at that point I just said, you know what? I'm happy with any pronunciation that anybody cares to use.
Well, it was also a love story that I mean, it was a book to me that said, I mean, I remember when the first volume, was it Quicksilver is the first Baroque trilogy?
Yeah.
When that came out, I went on it came out like Christmas Day or so, you know, and I just went to the bookstore that day because I had just finished Kryptonomicon, and I wanted more of those characters.
Oh, that's good timing.
I know, you just did it. You did it perfectly. Will you tell us? Will you just share with us one or two science fiction, current science fiction writers that you have a lot of respect for? And
yeah, Matt Ruff, who's a friend of ours here in Seattle, has written a series. I shouldn't call it a series. He has, every book he writes is very different and very good. And one of his recent ones, Lovecraft Country, is now being adapted for television, which is incredibly exciting. Then I really enjoyed Annalee Newitz's recent book, which now I'm going to embarrass myself by autonomy.
oh, you know, now I'm going to go pick it up right after we finish.
Yeah, but it's about biotech and AI, and I thought it was a great read. Another one that may have escaped the notice of science fiction readers is Crooked by Austin Grossman, which is, he's the guy who wrote Soon I Will Be Invincible and other works, but Crooked is a fictional autobiography of Richard Nixon, in which he explains that the whole time, during his whole career, he was single-handedly fighting a battle against Lovecraftian demons that were trying to take over the world. And so everything that happened to him that we look askance at, like before the Kennedy debate, where he was famous for being so pallid and sweaty. He had just backstage immediately before he went on camera. He had been in a encounter with a demonic, force that had tried to attack him. So of course he's going to look like a mess when but nobody understands him. Nobody appreciates. Yeah. So that's a super fun, enjoyable read.
That sounds like a good book. Yeah. Well, thank you for those recommendations, but thank you most especially for writing such thought-provoking and engrossing books that have kept me going over these last many years.
Thanks, you're very kind. Yeah, thanks.